was the former president of HPHA. My name is Jonathan Wharton, and I'm actually an assistant professor over at Stevens Institute of Technology. And as a matter of fact, I study state and local government for a living. So I was very thrilled when Diane and others from the board said, well, why don't we have a discussion about, former Assemblyman Manzo's recent publication. And I think it's a great idea, because obviously in light of everything going on politically here in New Jersey, there's a lot that's covered in the book. And it's very pertinent for us, obviously, as residents here in Paul's Hook. So I just have at least kind of my prepared comments, and then obviously we're going to have some questions. It's been suggested I kind of do the Frost-Nixon format, in the sense of just keep on plugging away with some questions and seeing whether in terms of resolving an actual matter of the original question. So as many of us know about Louis Manzo, he served as our city's Department of Health chief, as well as our district state assemblyman. He was also New York City mayoral candidate back in 2009. That same year was when Manzo, along with 42 other individuals, were arrested by the FBI, and they were accused of accepting bribes through Operation Bid Rig 3. Well, the federal government charged numerous public officials, rabbis, and individuals with conspiracy, money laundering, and accepting bribes from undercover federal informant Solomon Dweck. Manzo challenged prosecutors of his innocence. And a federal district court judge dropped the charges, and Manzo would go on to writing his book, which was published just this spring. While passages of his book at least address Manzo's trials and certainly trials and tribulations of being falsely charged in the sting, a good portion of the work is about then U.S. Attorney for New Jersey, Christie, and his supporters' tenacity to getting the governor elected and drum up attention for national office. Some in the press are calling Manzo's book a psychoanalysis of Christie, and that he, quote, seems to be consumed with bitterness and obsessed with seeking revenge, end of quote. In fact, one other reviewer found that Manzo, quote, gives readers ample reason to dismiss his claims by resorting to name-calling, which cheapens his case, and some outlandish comparisons, end of quote. And this is most coming from Jersey Journal, Star Ledger, you guys read the newspapers, who I'm talking about specifically. While I'm prone to agree at least with some of these critics, I must offer that Manzo does a heroic job of gathering countless sources to offer a rich narrative of Christie's rise to statewide and eventually national fame. Now, Christie's notoriety was done on the backs of those arrested and falsely arrested, including, obviously, our former assemblyman, by Christie and the federal government. That's for the reader to ultimately decide. After all, the publisher has a history of publishing conspiratorial manuscripts. But Manzo at least attempts to make his work current, as the governor and his supporters are facing several state and federal investigations that we're all familiar with. As credible as I find Manzo as a former public official and falsely arrested in New Jersey, and I have to admit I worked for Albus Legislative Services back in the day, so I'm certainly aware of all the things he's done, I cannot help myself, especially as an academic, after reading especially the final chapters of the book. Was his work merely a Christie psychobiography, as many have offered, or was it a Christie diatribe? So in order to get to the bottom of this, I offer at least some of my own questions here, and of course we're going to have the audience to participate. Breeze, you pass around cards, right? And I think Diane has some, so if you all have not had a chance to fill one out, feel free to do so, and we'll go through those. So the first question, of course, I want to ask you, Assemblyman, is you, and according to others, find and describe as Christie not only a driven opportunist early in his career, but someone with a, quote, burning ambition, who would go on and thrust himself into the public stage. You go on to offer that this becomes a trademark for Christie, especially as a Morris County freeholder and certainly a lawyer, lobbyist, ultimately U.S. Attorney for New Jersey and governor. But what makes Christie any different than any other politician, particularly in New Jersey? And aren't elected officials prone to being opportunistic and their supporters becoming political zealots? Even as a political official yourself, were you not prone to that as well?
There is a fine line between an elected official saying something or promising something and then not delivering on it, which is not a heinous act, if you will. It's, a bad politician or a bad elected official. And one who uses the law or subverts the law and his office to accomplish personal and self-political preservation gains. And that's the difference I see between a Christie, per se, as a U.S. attorney in particular, when he left the office, handed it over to people he appointed, put the Bid Rig 3 sting in place, and basically, as the book plays out, was an abuse of power to attain an office. So that's the fine line. The fine line is, you can say things to get elected and then not deliver, shame on you. But when you cross the line and you break laws and you great guidelines that that you swore an oath to uphold, that's a little bit different, and that's the fine line that the book zeroes in on.
Even for his supporters and some of his staff members, you trace some of that as well, that they follow along with him.
Yeah, and I don't know whether that is in as much a fear, although those who participated, especially the U.S. attorneys, who were contributing to his campaign and prosecuting a case that ultimately would benefit his election, it was a clear conflict of interest. They had guidelines, and they knew they should have known better. Even his successor had no answer in court papers to how that how that transpired. Just said the prosecutors would never fudge the law to profit. But we know the facts are that a group of about 16 prosecutors prosecuted these cases. They all wound up, most of them wound up in Christie's administration, and a good number of them made contributions to him and were in fact in touch with Christie, from Christie's words, when these arrests went down, and in particular the one who ordered the arrest, Michelle Brown, had a $40,000 loan from Christie at the time she's ordering the arrest. Her words, she wanted them done before Christie's successor came into office so that he would be credited with them before the gubernatorial election.
Right. So you tend to contextualize Christie as somewhat aloof with making decisions and taking responsibility. It appears that too often others, particularly staff supporters, are making decisions, whether you served as a federal attorney or as a governor. What makes you so sure that this is his weakness? Do you sense at least Christie fails to see this weakness, and that this will be ultimately his political, Achilles heel in future political circumstances?
I think it's what you see is that there's a group of staffers that have made decisions, as you'll see in bid rigging, and what the book describes is that they're put in place, and that's the design, to make it, if you will, set up straw men or people to take a fall in case something goes awry. Now in bid rig, he did put in place Dweck. He put in place the location where Dweck was to go, but then he handed off the office to, because of the federal law, Christie got to pick who his successor was going to be, and he positioned those people in his office. Now, by law, he was supposed to report the loan to the first assistant who was handling this thing, Michelle Brown. He did not 3 times. Others in that office knew about that, and they should have certainly reported it, especially the guy in charge of the criminal division who at the time was also instrumental in running this thing.
So now I'm going to get at least a little bit more thorny here in the sense of, how you actually frame Chris Christie. I mean, you call him a P.T. Barnum, a weather vane, a media showman, especially when it comes to the bid rig arrests. Certainly in terms, he gives great examples of what takes place at the town hall meetings. And you even call Christie's politics duplicitous, or you call it Christie speak, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as you even say it throughout the book. But isn't that kind of the nature of Jersey politics, to play to the media, to play to the voters, the party bosses? Even in your final chapter, you make some pretty controversial statements about Christie, saying his addiction to power, his self-gratification will ultimately do him in. I mean, you make a lot of these kind of tones there, especially in the final chapter.
Yeah.
What are you trying to go after?
What I'm basically alluding to is there's a part of the book that deals with the prosecution phase, him in the prosecutor's office. And I was particularly careful in that phase of the book to let documents speak for themselves. And I've reserved actually the final chapter, the afterword in the book, and the last chapter's subsection to vent, if you will, what I saw. Now, I will not make any apologies for my anger. I think anger is an appropriate response to injustice. And I certainly will, what angered me in the book more, what my pointing out these things at Christie is not something that I'm just aiming at just Christie, but those of you who know me, one of the persons I criticized immensely when I was an assemblyman was the former governor, John Corzine, who was of my own party, much to my own party's consternation because of his sometimes policies like Christie's, which were more in line with, helping others rather than the state. But what I point out is that there was duplicitousness on Christie's part and a sort of Jekyll and Hyde when he runs out to California and he's knocking the Affordable Care Act, and at the same time he's back in New Jersey and he's accepting federal money, to plug the budget hole, and speaking out of both sides of his mouth. I found an irony in that we all know as Assembly people, or Stretton knows the problem with the tax situation in the state. It's that we're funding too much of our school systems through property tax. Okay? It's been a problem that they failed to address over a series of Democratic and Republican administrations. And it won't get resolved until that problem is resolved. Christie, however, chooses to go into a town hall meeting and demonize, if you will, teachers or public employees and their pensions and their benefits as the problem. Now, granted, they might have lucrative negotiated benefits, but that is not the problem. The problem has been a succession of Republican and mostly Democratic administrations have failed to fund those pension systems over a course of about 15 years. And that's what drew the debt in the city. Now, in the meantime, what they don't tell you is that a lot of that money was used to get tax relief, and governors telling mayors, don't include your pension payment to your employees this year. Just take that out of your budget and don't raise taxes. That became tax relief. Rebate checks were cut under McGreevy, for example, under the same thing. Don't pay the pension fund. Let's give rebate checks out because it was around an election time. Okay, all of that, 15 years of that, it adds up. So to go into a town hall knowing that, and to simply play a game of, well, this teacher or that teacher has this benefit and draws this salary, and sort of play a have and have not game with the public is disingenuous. And it's not addressing what the real root of the problem is. And he does this cleverly. I mean, I've researched his town hall meetings. He's a master at it, and it's what I call Christie speak. It's disingenuous. It's not addressing a problem, but what it is it's taking anger in that audience and funneling it where he wants it to be funneled, against his political enemies, sort of winning people over to his side by doing so.
And you even say that he's living in a fantasy land of his own narcissism, that really is pretending to himself and the whole world that is lying there, and he's someone telling the truth. But by your writing such statements, do you think that's prejudicial? I mean, why do you think a reader might find you credible, particularly in light of your circumstances that you've gone through?
Well, particularly in light of the circumstances that a federal judge saw fit that there was no case against me. But more importantly, I started the book off with a quote from Christie, which he said, believe it or not, on the hinge of the bridge gate. This is the opening line to the book. Listen, I'm a trained lawyer. You know what that means? I can make anything sound convincing. So when you start with that premise and you're bragging about that at a public meeting, you invite the criticism that I brought. One other thing that I have to say is that the book covers a career of Christie which began in the 80s when he makes a try for a freeholder seat, and it captures him up to a governorship, and it's condensed, if you will, all of that behavior in the 300 some odd pages. So when you're reading it in rapid succession, I'm finding, as the Star Ledger author of a review of my book found, that he himself got angry. And he said, well, I was writing angry. Yes, granted, I wrote things that pertain to me in those sections as anger, but most of the book are quotes from Christie's people, from Christie himself, and from public documents and from press accounts. So I think what it is that when you see that all that assembled, and you're a person who follows government or is interested in what's going on, is going to be angry. Now, whether they address that as you know,
Bias.
my causing or bias,
Right.
you know, that's up for the reader to walk away with, but, you know, it's all factual, it's all documented. There's 50 pages of notes of a bibliography and chapter notes.
It's subsequent. I mean, it is very credible. And obviously, I should admit, at least to people out here, that in fact, you really put that more towards the end of the book.
Yes, I did. Yeah, and I tried. I wanted to do that. I didn't want. I wanted to express my opinion. You take 5 years of research, and you certainly want your opinion to be expressed. But I thought it would be unfair of me to express it throughout the book. So, I would say with the exception of the afterword of the book and the last subchapter of the book, all of those accounts are from the words of, Christie's former colleagues in the U.S. Attorney's Office, his words, again, public documents and press accounts.
Yeah, press accounts. Yeah, there's a lot of press accounts in the book. It's impressive there. As a matter of fact, speaking of additional books, you do at least bring up, the book, The Jersey Sting.
Yes, and The Jersey Sting.
And Sherman and Margolin's book is obviously legendary. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. I've read it myself a couple of times. It's very helpful to understand Operation Bidwick and how it actually took place. And you even argue that it's kind of like the government's going after kind of a fishing expedition. They got creative.
They got very creative and they got very selective.
Right.
And the timing was essential, as we see. There's things that I point out in the book that when you run a sting, and you're targeting someone, in this country that, everybody has rights and laws, and there has to be predication or a reason for you wanting to go after someone other than that they live in Hudson County and they practice politics here. Just because so-and-so robbed a bank and he used to live in this house, the new family coming in doesn't mean we target them because they might be bank robbers. And that's what happened here. And the words of the federal prosecutor's own bragging about the sting to the guys who wrote the Jersey Sting, they said basically in Hudson County, they have two types of politicians. They're either corrupt or dead. So that was basically, in my estimation, the predication that was done for, running a sting and picking up 30 various council candidates, mayor candidates throughout the county.
But are you surprised that this was ground zero for this Operation Big Rig 3? You even call it ground zero.
Yeah, it was ground zero. And when you again, looking at his career as a U.S. attorney, from him trying to make an attempt to run for governor in 2005 and piling it on, trying to go after McGreevey, and then the disaster with McGreevey resigning and no one seeing John Corzine stepping in and Christie having to step back at that point and say, he's the 800-pound gorilla, I can't get into this race. And then, surgically, I should say, beginning a series of prosecutions and targeting through Democratic strongholds throughout the state. It was almost as if, and I mentioned this in the book, it was almost as if you were a strategist and saying, how does a Republican win statewide office? Well, you have to do good in these districts and you got to hope your opponents are doing bad in these districts. And in the districts or the counties where your opponent had to do bad, it just happened to coincide with prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office indicting key politicians in those areas. Not to say that it was undeserved or that there wasn't a crime there. I didn't get into that specific, but I'm just saying that the targeting fit a pattern.
And you even go on to say that, in fact, turnout was obviously problematic.
In Jersey City, there was a 22,000, from the last gubernatorial election, there was a 22,000 vote swing, if you will, in the turnout in Jersey City, mainly operators who were picked up in this thing or others who were afraid to even get involved in politics after that nightmare went down. Just didn't turn out.
But you really don't discuss at least the history surrounding Hudson County in the sense that this is a place of legacy in terms of corruption, problematic machine politics.
There is no question about that. But again, that doesn't mean we profile people. It doesn't mean we profile all people in Hudson County as being corrupt or dead, as they say. There's a law, there's a constitution, and it should be followed. And that's what angered me the most throughout this whole thing, is that the prosecutors who handled this case and rushed the prosecution were playing with one thing. They knew that listen to this, in 97% of cases brought by the federal government in prosecutions, there's a plea deal arrived at. Okay? So they were playing those odds. They were rolling the dice and saying, you know, this rabble is going to fold, make plea deals, and you know, we're going to roll the dice. That's what I heard.
Well, no, and then you remind from the readers there that the federal government practices a lot of record keeping, certainly a lot of problems related to prosecutorial policies, and even the judge reminded you in that case when it came to the Hobbs Act, and certainly the Travel Act. I don't know if you want to discuss a little bit of that.
I'll just, you know, basically, you assume that, or I always had the assumption that someone who aspires a career as a prosecutor, especially on the federal level, is you would assume that they have a certain core ethical belief or come with a set of core ethics because you're in the big leagues and you know, you're really handling the rule of law for our country, you know, whether it's the judiciary or federal prosecutors. And I think what the federal prosecutor scandal years ago showed us is that this is endemic to the system. It's not Democrat, Republican, but prosecutors, and the USA Today did a fantastic series of stories, one which just ran last week, and they've been doing it, showing you that prosecutors throughout the country, from both parties, have been feathering their nests or future nests with their offices by, you know, trampling the rights, if you will, of defendants. And in our case, it was basic. They misread a law, which their guidelines told them not to apply the way they tried to apply it. They then used an informant who was mentally ill, and there are people sitting in jail right now who were convicted on testimony from a witness they knew was mentally ill and who they hid those documents from the court and from their defendants. They then told this informant, according to his testimony, exactly what to do. Mainly, he funneled about $400,000 of money into campaigns in Jersey City and Hoboken and corrupted the election results. It's absolutely against the federal law for the government to use money, sting money, to effectuate the outcome of an election. And the direction, all the evidence that was told to this informant had to be kept in his file, not a trace of it exists. Not a trace of it exists. In violation of FBI guidelines, in violation of U.S. Attorney guidelines. And in fact, when the same informant had implicated supporters of the governor in other counties, mainly Monmouth and Ocean County, that evidence also was suppressed, kept from the court, and those prosecutions were just dismissed, never brought forward. I even have an FBI document, which I allude to in the book, which has, he was made a judge by Christie, it was Joe Oxley. Dweck sat down with him in Monmouth County and was giving Oxley campaign contributions in exchange for Oxley giving him information on future foreclosure properties, so Dweck could come in and negotiate a fair price. This is documented by the FBI. I have 2 302 reports. It's an FBI document. Same date. One, it's reported, and one it's not. And the one they give to the defense counsel is the one where it's not reported. We happen to get a pile of documents we assume from a U.S. attorney, which were dropped on our, you know, on my front porch actually, in Belmar, which had a slew of documents that the government never turned over to the other defendants.
Well, you certainly scared the reader by stating, you know, the following quote: "Federal prosecutors can break the law with impunity. They can arrest you on a whim. You just have to live with this right in fact." End quote. So, what kind of things can American citizens do to prevent prosecutorial abuse, especially in the case of yours?
I think you have to get all over. You know, when things like this happen, and we missed the boat really when that whole scandal evolved in the U.S. Attorney scandal. And what happened there is basically the Department of Justice grabbed the reins, if you will, and tried to do what they always do, is they self-police themselves. And that's why these problems with prosecutors, as the USA Today reported, 98% of the incidents of prosecutorial misconduct are found there's not a problem, 98%. Only 2% of the cases of misconduct reported wind up with a sanction, and it's usually a slap in the wrist. And what I see has to happen is that there needs to be at least a cooling off period between a U.S. attorney leaving office and deciding to run for a political office.
Okay.
So there's not the temptation to use that, so maybe a 2-year, 3-year, take a break before you run for political office. We do that in Trenton.
Same thing with Congress.
Right, and Congress.
Right.
So perhaps that should be done, and most importantly, the Inspector General should have charge of all investigations of prosecutorial misconduct and not the Office of Professional Responsibilities, where it lies within the Department of Justice and is run by the same prosecutors who are breaking the law. They're going to police their peers. It just doesn't happen.
Hello and welcome to Speak and Jay. I'm here today on Wayne Street between Henderson and Grove Streets in downtown Jersey City. Directly behind me are several parked cars in what the city has now designated a taxi stand only space. Doing so has virtually eliminated 5 residential parking spots in an already overcrowded area. The space behind me was to be for taxi cabs who are presently parked on Columbus Drive, a block to the north. And the taxi cab drivers and owners are upset because they're forced to move here to Wayne Street and to Grove Street, and they fear that the people exiting the path will not be able to see them. And so for the last month, since the end of June, which is now the end of July, the cab drivers are not parking here. Residents are parking here continuously in the last month and are receiving parking tickets as a result. I've talked to several of them, and they've expressed their displeasure at the fact that the city did not properly notify them that this was taking place. But they're also quite upset that these parking spaces are being eliminated, and they'll have to look around and scramble more to find a parking space at the end of the day. So that's the present situation. It seems to be a conundrum that the city of Jersey City has to face now and address very quickly with the cab drivers and the residents here to resolve this situation once and for all. I'm standing here adjacent to the taxi stand, or what was the taxi stand on Columbus Drive, before the city eliminated it over a month ago and created a bus stop in its place. But as you can see, the taxi cabs are still lined up here. There's about a half dozen presently lined up along Columbus Drive, and they are directly adjacent to the PATH station. It seems the cab drivers have a pretty good point in not wanting to park around the corner where the public, once exiting PATH, will have a difficult time finding them. So it's a situation that needs to be addressed, and addressed by the city quickly.